Welcome to the Behind Story, where the wildest Karen encounters come to life. Get ready for jaw-dropping, hilarious, and downright unbelievable moments as Karens take entitlement to the next level. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a crazy story. Let's jump right in. Ethan Carter had always imagined a life of peace, a refuge from the hustle and bustle of the city. After years of cramped apartments, where the sound of neighbors' arguments and traffic seeped through the thin walls, he was ready for a change. The suburban neighborhood he'd chosen was everything he had ever dreamed of: a spacious home with a backyard pool, surrounded by lush trees, and best of all, away from the oppressive rules of a homeowners association. The previous owner had opted out of the HOA, and that detail alone sealed the deal for Ethan. For the first time, he felt truly free. The house was more than just a structure to Ethan, it was a symbol of freedom, a place where he could finally relax. The scent of fresh air, the sound of birds chirping, the stillness of the morning, all of it was a stark contrast to the noise of his old city life. He could spend his weekends lounging by the pool, reading, grilling, or simply doing nothing. It was everything he had worked so hard for. No one to tell him when to cut his grass. No one to demand that he repaint his fence a certain color. He was in control here, and the thought made him smile every time he stepped outside. But that tranquility wouldn't last. It started with a sharp knock at the door on a humid Monday morning, just as Ethan was sipping his first cup of coffee. He hadn't even had time to enjoy the peace of his morning when it was shattered by the sound. He walked to the door, still groggy, and found an older man standing on the porch, clipboard in hand. The man's face was as stiff as his business suit, and the smug smile on his face was one of authority, a smile that only someone who had spent years wielding power could wear. The man introduced himself as Gerald Whitmore, the head of the neighborhood's HOA. Ethan was about to return to his coffee, assuming this was some sort of mistake, but Gerald wasted no time. Without even so much as a greeting, he handed over a letter. It looked official, the kind of paper you'd expect to see from a legal office, and the moment Ethan glanced at it, he felt a knot form in his stomach. The letter stated that his property was in violation of community guidelines. His pool was unauthorized and had to be drained immediately. Ethan stared at the letter, trying to process the words. There had to be a mistake. His home was exempt from the HOA's jurisdiction. He knew this because he had made sure of it before purchasing the house. The previous owner had opted out, and Ethan had signed documents confirming that the house would remain outside the HOA's control. The whole point of moving here was to escape the suffocating grip of an HOA. "I think you have the wrong house," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm, though a spark of frustration began to ignite within him. But Gerald simply smiled, a smile that made Ethan's stomach churn. "Oh, there have been some updates to the neighborhood bylaws," Gerald replied, as though Ethan should already know this. "I suggest you read through them carefully." Ethan shook his head, feeling his pulse quicken. "I don't need to read them. I have legal documents stating that my property isn't part of the HOA." He flipped the letter over, searching for any sign of legitimacy, but all he saw was a series of vague statements and no real legal threat. "I'll be keeping my pool," Ethan said firmly, trying to stand his ground. Gerald's smile never wavered. "You may want to reconsider that," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence that only someone in a position of power could have. With that, he turned and walked off the porch without another word, leaving Ethan standing in the doorway, the letter still in his hand. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He brushed it off as a mistake. Surely the HOA had nothing to do with him. After all, he wasn't even under their jurisdiction. This was just a bureaucratic glitch, a mistake in paperwork. At least, that's what he told himself. But as the day went on, the uneasy feeling in his gut didn't go away. The next morning, a second letter arrived. This one wasn't polite. It was aggressive, demanding that he pay a fine for the pool $100 per day until it was drained. Ethan clenched his jaw, his frustration building. He ignored the letter, assuming this was just the HOA trying to scare him into compliance. But it didn't stop there. By the next evening, someone had trespassed onto his property. His pool gate, which had been left unlocked, was now chained shut. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at the padlock. He marched toward his toolbox, grabbed a pair of bolt cutters, and snipped the chain in one swift motion. They weren't going to intimidate him. This was his property, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. Little did Ethan know, this was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to back down so easily, and neither was he. The morning after the encounter with Gerald Whitmore, Ethan stood on his porch, staring at the chain that had been placed on his pool gate. His hands clenched into fists as he paced back and forth. He had thought the situation would end with a simple misunderstanding, but it was clear now that the HOA wasn't backing down. They weren't just going to leave him alone. This was their territory, and they would fight to take control of it, no matter what. Ethan wasn't just angry anymore, he was furious. How dare they trespass on his property? How dare they try to bully him into submission? He had spent years fighting for his peace, and now, just as he thought he'd found it, these strangers were coming to destroy it. He had to fight back, but the next blow came swiftly. As Ethan was returning from the mailbox that afternoon, he saw the familiar envelope from the HOA once again. His stomach turned as he ripped it open, already dreading what was inside. This time it wasn't just a fine. It was worse, much worse. The letter informed him that the fines for his pool had doubled. The HOA was now demanding $1,200 a day until his pool was drained. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words. He could barely believe it. They were threatening him with a sum that could ruin him. And yet, he knew that wasn't all. He knew they weren't going to stop until he gave in. Anger coursed through his veins. The HOA was using everything in its power to break him down. They weren't just trying to make him follow the rules, they were trying to force him into submission, to make him realize that no matter how hard he fought, he would always be under their thumb. They were trying to strip him of everything he had fought for, his property, his autonomy, his peace. But Ethan wasn't going to let that happen. He stuffed the letter into his pocket and stormed into his house, his mind racing. He couldn't just ignore this. He had to fight back, and he had to do it now. The thought of draining the pool, of giving in to their demands, was unbearable. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no one was going to take it from him. As he walked through his house, he could feel the walls closing in on him. The more he resisted, the more the HOA pushed. They were relentless. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about control. They were making a statement. Anyone who dared defy the HOA would be crushed. Ethan wasn't just some homeowner. They saw him as a threat, someone who needed to be dealt with. And the more he stood his ground, the more aggressive they became. The next day, it went from bad to worse. As Ethan was leaving for work, he noticed a city utility truck parked in front of his house. A worker in a neon vest was walking up to his door, clipboard in hand. Ethan's heart sank. He already knew what this was about. The worker introduced himself, but Ethan barely heard the words. "We've received a complaint from the HOA about unauthorized water usage," the worker explained, looking at Ethan with an apologetic expression. "They claim your pool is violating water conservation laws. We've been instructed to shut off your service until the matter is resolved." For a moment, Ethan just stood there, dumbfounded. This couldn't be happening. The HOA had already started using the city's resources to carry out their vendetta. It wasn't enough to fine him or chain his pool gate. They were now trying to take away his water, his lifeblood, his freedom. "I'm not in the HOA," Ethan spat, his voice sharp with frustration. "You can't do this." The worker just shrugged, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to take it up with them." Ethan's anger flared. This wasn't just about the pool or the fines anymore. This was a full-on assault on his way of life. They were trying to strip him of everything, using every tool at their disposal to make him bend. And Ethan wasn't going to let it happen. He walked back into his house, his mind racing. He needed to act. He needed to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. But as the day wore on, Ethan began to feel something else creeping in: fear. His neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, were beginning to look at him with wary eyes. Some avoided eye contact altogether, unsure of where the HOA stood in relation to Ethan. Others whispered behind his back, talking in hushed tones about the trouble he was causing in the neighborhood. Ethan felt the walls closing in again, this time not just from the HOA, but from the very people who had once made him feel welcome. One evening, as he walked to the mailbox, he was stopped by Franklin Dupree, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Franklin had always been a bit of a recluse, but Ethan had respected him for his quiet wisdom. "You're fighting a battle most of us gave up on years ago," Franklin said, his voice low and tired. "These people, they don't play fair." Ethan shook his head, trying to stay calm. "I'm not part of their HOA. I have the legal documents to prove it." Franklin chuckled, a dark, resigned sound. "Legal has nothing to do with it," he said, looking around as if ensuring no one else was listening. "They'll twist the system however they need to. Trust me, they won't stop until they have you right where they want you." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just fighting the HOA. He was fighting a system that had been entrenched for years, a system that would stop at nothing to maintain control. The war had begun, and Ethan wasn't sure how it would end. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up without a fight. The days following the HOA's blatant harassment felt like a blur to Ethan. Every time he stepped outside, his nerves tightened. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, cornered, manipulated into a position where he would have no choice but to comply. The HOA had already crossed the line. They were using city officials to enforce their demands, bullying him in ways he couldn't have anticipated, and every attempt to fight back seemed to be met with something worse. But despite the constant pressure, Ethan refused to bend. He spent every free moment researching the HOA's legal grounds, sifting through documents, and digging into his rights. It wasn't just about a pool anymore, it was about something much bigger. This was about control, power, and the corrupt system that held the neighborhood in its grip. One night, as the weight of the situation threatened to crush him, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the Rusty Anchor. You need to know what you're dealing with." Ethan hesitated. Who was this? He had no idea, but the message stirred something in him, a mix of fear and curiosity. The Rusty Anchor was a dive bar on the outskirts of town, far from the pristine suburban streets he now called home. He'd never been there, but something about the message felt urgent, like it was the last chance to uncover the truth. He grabbed his jacket and left the house, the sound of the door closing behind him feeling strangely final. As he drove, the street seemed emptier than usual, the streetlights flickering in a way that made him feel even more isolated. The Rusty Anchor stood in the distance like a beacon of uncertainty, a place where things could either go terribly wrong or finally reveal the answers he was searching for. When Ethan arrived, he spotted a woman sitting alone in a dark corner booth, swirling a glass of whiskey. Her face was partially obscured by shadows, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. As he approached, she looked up and gave him a small, knowing smile. "You must be Ethan," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I'm Samantha Harrove." She spoke with a calm confidence that immediately set Ethan on edge. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, that made him believe she wasn't someone to be trifled with. "I've heard of you," Ethan said, taking a seat across from her. "You are a lawyer? What do you know about the HOA?" Samantha set her glass down and leaned in slightly. "I tried to take them down years ago," she said, her voice low and filled with quiet anger. "But they don't just bend the rules, they rewrite them whenever they want. The HOA you're dealing with isn't just about community guidelines. They've been doing this for years, and they've ruined more lives than you can count." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had suspected there was more to this story, but hearing it from someone who had fought the same battle made the reality hit harder. "They've been using every trick in the book to force homeowners into compliance," Samantha continued, her tone deadly serious. "Complaints, fines, even threats. But it doesn't stop there. They have people on the inside, city inspectors, contractors, even local law enforcement. They forge documents, fabricate complaints, manipulate records, and intimidate anyone who dares to resist." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The realization was horrifying. The HOA wasn't just a petty bureaucracy, it was a machine built on deception, corruption, and control, and he had walked right into it. Samantha slid a thick folder across the table to him. "This is everything you need to know," she said. "The proof is in there. They're not just overstepping their authority, they're committing outright fraud." Ethan opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. There were legal documents, forged signatures, records of unauthorized fines, and even fraudulent amendments to the HOA's bylaws. But one document caught his attention, a contract with his name on it, claiming that he had agreed to rejoin the HOA. Ethan's blood ran cold as he scanned the signature. It wasn't his. "They faked my signature," he muttered in disbelief. Samantha nodded. "And if you don't expose them now, they'll make sure it sticks. They'll have all the evidence they need to make you look like the one breaking the rules." Ethan slammed the folder shut, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer about a pool or a fine. It was about exposing a criminal syndicate that had been operating under the guise of an HOA. The magnitude of the situation hit him with full force. These people weren't just bullies, they were criminals, and they had to be stopped. As the anger surged within him, Ethan's resolve solidified. He wasn't just going to fight for his property, he was going to fight for justice. The HOA had taken everything from him, his peace, his security, and now they had even forged his name. He wasn't going to let them get away with it, but he knew this battle wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had resources, power, and allies in high places. And now that Ethan had uncovered the truth, he was more certain than ever that they wouldn't let him expose them without a fight. But he was ready. It was time to bring them down. Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the evidence Samantha had given him. The weight of it felt suffocating. This wasn't just a simple dispute anymore. The HOA had forged his signature, manipulated records, and used every tool at their disposal to force him into compliance. They weren't just bullies, they were criminals. And now Ethan had the proof to bring them down. But as the reality of what he was up against began to sink in, so did the fear. Taking on the HOA would be no easy task. They had money, power, and connections in high places. They could make his life a living hell, and he knew they would stop at nothing to destroy him. They'd already stolen his peace, his security, and now they were trying to take away his home. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the table. It was a message from Franklin Dupree, the elderly man who had warned him about the HOA's power. "Meet me tomorrow," the text read. "I've got something that could help." The next day, Ethan met Franklin at a small coffee shop at the edge of town. Franklin's face was grim as he sat down across from him. "I've been talking to some of the neighbors," Franklin said in a low voice. "They're afraid. The HOA has been controlling this neighborhood for years, and most people are too scared to speak up. But there are a few who've had enough." Ethan leaned forward, listening intently. "What are they saying?" Franklin's eyes flickered to the door before he continued. "They've been documenting everything. Fines, unauthorized inspections, threats. We're not the only ones they've targeted. They've been pushing people around for years, and I think we can use that. If we can get enough people together, We can fight back. We can expose them for what they really are. Ethan's heart raced. This was what he had been waiting for. But the path ahead wouldn't be easy. How do we start? Franklin smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. We gather evidence. The more people we have, the stronger our case will be, and we need to take this to the public. If we can make enough noise, the city will have to listen. The fight had begun. Over the next few days, Ethan and Franklin went door to door, gathering testimonies from their neighbors. Each story they heard was more infuriating than the last homeowners who had been fined for minor infractions, families who had been harassed for years, all under the oppressive rule of the HOA. Many of the residents were too scared to speak out, but some like Franklin were ready to take a stand. Samantha, who had been tirelessly working on the legal front, joined them in their efforts. Together, they compiled a mountain of evidence, signed affidavits, photos, and detailed accounts of the HOA's illegal activities. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA had been operating like a criminal syndicate, using manipulation and fraud to control the neighborhood. They weren't just an overbearing neighborhood committee, they were a dangerous, corrupt organization that had to be stopped. But as Ethan and his team worked to expose the truth, the HOA was preparing for their retaliation. It was only a matter of time before they would try to shut Ethan down completely. The first sign of their next move came when Ethan arrived home one evening to find a notice on his door. The HOA was demanding that he immediately vacate the premises, claiming that his property was in violation of their rules. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were going to try to take his house. He knew this wasn't just a simple legal issue anymore. The HOA had declared war, and they weren't going to back down. Ethan had no choice but to fight back, and this time, he wasn't going to fight alone. Samantha, Franklin, and the group of neighbors who had joined them were ready. They had the evidence. They had the support. And most importantly, they had the truth on their side. The fight was going to be long, and it was going to be brutal. The HOA had the power to make Ethan's life miserable, but they couldn't silence the truth. The more Ethan thought about the damage the HOA had caused to so many families, the angrier he became. It wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of every homeowner who had been bullied into submission by these corrupt tyrants. The plan was simple: go public, expose the HOA for what they really were, but doing so would be risky. They would need to be careful to ensure that every move they made was calculated. Any mistake, any misstep, could cost them everything. As the team prepared for the battle ahead, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just him. This wasn't just about a pool or a fine, it was about justice, about standing up to a corrupt system that had taken advantage of too many people for too long. Ethan knew that the fight ahead would change everything. Whether he won or lost, nothing would ever be the same again, and he was ready. The war against the HOA had reached a boiling point. Every day, the pressure mounted. Ethan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him, but he had no intention of backing down. The evidence was there, the support was growing, and the truth was on his side. He just had to make sure it all came together in time. Samantha had been working tirelessly, crafting airtight legal arguments, while Franklin and the group of neighbors gathered more testimonies. The momentum was building. It was time to go public. The story of the HOA's corruption, the years of harassment, the fraud, it all had to come out, and it would. Ethan would make sure of it. But the night before their big reveal, as Ethan sat alone in his living room, going over the final details of the plan, something shifted. A sudden realization hit him like a cold slap to the face. No matter how much evidence they had, no matter how many people were on their side, the HOA was not going to just lie down and let them expose everything. They wouldn't give up easily. They were ruthless, and they had power far more than Ethan had ever realized. The more he thought about it, the more he understood if he wanted to win this fight. He would have to outsmart them. The battle was far from over, and the real war was just beginning. Ethan woke up the next morning to an ominous silence. There was no city truck parked in front of his house, no letter shoved in his mailbox. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. But just as he was about to brush it off, a knock came at the door. When Ethan opened it, he found a letter on the ground. His heart sank as he read it, the words blurring together for a moment as he processed the gravity of what it meant. The HOA had filed a lawsuit. They were accusing him of everything disturbing the peace, damaging community property, and more. The document was thick with legal jargon, but the message was clear. The HOA was determined to take everything from him, his home, his peace, his life. But as Ethan stared at the letter, something in his gut told him this wasn't just a typical legal move. No, this felt different. There was an undertone of something darker, something more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting for his home anymore, he was fighting for his freedom. He immediately called Samantha, explaining the situation. She listened carefully before responding. "This is it, Ethan. They've upped the stakes. They're not just fighting you over the pool anymore, they're fighting you for everything. We need to make sure we hit them where it hurts." As the two of them strategized, Franklin joined them, bringing with him the latest batch of evidence. But there was a new urgency in the air. They had to act fast. The HOA was making its move, and Ethan knew they wouldn't hesitate to use any tactic at their disposal. That evening, they gathered everything they had: affidavits, financial records, photos, and sent it all to a local news station. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward for weeks. The HOA couldn't hide the truth anymore. The story would break, and the entire neighborhood would know exactly what kind of monsters were running the HOA. The next 48 hours were a blur. Ethan couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow of the HOA looming over him. Would they retaliate? Would they try to destroy the evidence? He had no idea what they were capable of, but he knew they wouldn't take this lying down. Then the story hit. It was everywhere. The article exposing the HOA's fraud, their manipulation, their forged documents. The public outrage was immediate. The city hall was flooded with calls demanding action. The pressure on the local government was undeniable, and the authorities had no choice but to launch an investigation. The first casualty of the storm was Gerald Whitmore, the smug, self-assured leader of the HOA. He tried to spin the situation, releasing a statement accusing Ethan of being a disgruntled homeowner. But it was too late. The cracks were already showing. The truth had already been revealed. The next morning, Ethan woke up to a different world. The air felt lighter. His phone was blowing up with messages of support. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact were now stopping him on the street, shaking his hand, thanking him for exposing the corruption. Ethan felt the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. He had won, but the battle wasn't over yet. Later that day, a knock at the door once again interrupted Ethan's peace. When he opened it, he was met with a formal eviction notice. The HOA was declaring war. They were taking legal action to seize his home. It was the final blow. They were trying to steal everything he had fought for. Ethan didn't panic. He wasn't going to lose his home. Not after everything he'd been through. The HOA had pushed him to the edge, but they had underestimated him. This was his home, and he wasn't going to let them take it from him. The next day, in court, the fight reached its climax. The HOA came armed with their best lawyers, their stacks of paperwork, but it was clear from the start that they were on the defensive. Samantha tore apart their case, presenting the forged signatures, the manipulated records, the fraudulent bylaws. The final blow came when Franklin took the stand. He had lived through the HOA's rise to power, and he had evidence that could bring it all down. As he presented a hidden ledger documenting years of financial fraud and illegal property takeovers, the courtroom fell silent. Gerald Whitmore's smug demeanor cracked, and the jury could see the truth. The judge ruled immediately. The HOA's case was dismissed, The criminal investigation into the board began, and within days, Gerald and several other members were arrested. The HOA was officially dissolved. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. But just as Ethan began to savor his victory, an email arrived, a new proposal to restore the HOA. Ethan laughed, his heart full of defiance. They had learned nothing, but this time he was ready. He would never stop fighting for his freedom, for his home, and for the truth.